Can you imagine being dropped into a Norse winter where temperatures plummet to -40 degrees Fahrenheit? The sun disappears for months, and your survival depends on techniques that seem almost impossible. Vikings didn't just survive conditions like this, they thrived using methods that still baffle modern historians. Let me paint you a picture of just how impossible this challenge really was. We're talking about Scandinavia during a period when winters were brutal beyond anything most of us can imagine. In places like Greenland, Vikings regularly faced temperatures that dropped below -30 degrees for months at a time. The sun would completely disappear for weeks, and winds would howl at over 60 miles per hour. And remember, they had no modern insulation, no synthetic materials, and definitely no central heating as we know it today. Archaeological evidence shows us something remarkable. While other European settlements were experiencing winter mortality rates of up to 40%, Viking communities maintained stable populations year after year. That means while nearly half of other medieval people were dying during harsh winters, Vikings weren't just surviving, they were actually growing their communities and expanding into even harsher territories. They established permanent settlements in places that modern Arctic expeditions consider barely habitable. We're talking about Greenland, northern Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, places where even today, with all our technology, survival is challenging. Modern polar explorers spend months preparing for expeditions to these same regions, armed with synthetic fabrics, GPS devices, emergency beacons, and pre-packaged foods. Vikings moved there with their families and made it home. Climate reconstructions show that Vikings survived through both the medieval warm period and into the Little Ice Age, a period when temperatures dropped significantly across Europe. Yet their settlements continued to thrive, proving their techniques worked even when conditions got worse. This wasn't luck or just being tough. This was systematic knowledge and engineering that allowed them to turn the most hostile environment on Earth into a place where children could grow up safely. The scale of their success becomes even more impressive when you consider the logistics. Entire communities, sometimes hundreds of people, would survive together through months of extreme cold. They weren't just keeping individuals alive, they were maintaining complex social structures, continuing cultural traditions, and even expanding their knowledge and skills during the darkest months. Let's start with what might be the most impossible part of their success, their heating system. Vikings developed what can only be described as medieval central heating, and it was so effective that scientific experiments have shown a Viking longhouse could maintain 60 degrees inside when it was -30 degrees outside. Now, if you've ever had your furnace go out in January, you know how quickly a modern house loses heat. Vikings were achieving better results with nothing but carefully engineered architecture. Their longhouses weren't just buildings, they were thermal engineering marvels. The walls weren't single-layer timber like you might expect. They were double-layered systems packed with moss and turf, creating what modern engineers would recognize as advanced insulation. We're talking about walls that were sometimes nearly 6 feet thick, using alternating layers of peat, stone, and in places like Greenland, even whale bones as structural supports. But here's where the genius really shows. They understood thermal mass centuries before modern science gave it a name. Many longhouses were partially built into the ground, using the earth itself as a giant battery to store and release heat. The packed turf and earth would absorb heat during the day from their fires and slowly release it through the night, maintaining comfortable temperatures even when the fire died down. The engineering principles they used are still taught in modern architecture schools. The concept of using earth berming for insulation, the idea of thermal mass for heat storage, the sophisticated ventilation systems they developed, all of these are considered advanced techniques today. Yet Vikings were implementing them over 1,000 years ago, using only hand tools and local materials. The heating system centered around a carefully engineered open hearth that was much more sophisticated than just a fire pit. The central hearth was built on a stone slab designed to radiate heat evenly throughout the structure. Smoke escaped through precisely positioned roof vents that maintained airflow without losing precious heat. The positioning of these vents wasn't random. It was calculated to create optimal air circulation patterns that distributed heat while removing smoke and moisture. When modern researchers tested this system using traditional materials and methods, they were shocked by the results. One experiment in an Icelandic reconstruction showed that just 120 pounds of birchwood could heat an entire living space for over 40 hours. That's more fuel efficient than many modern heating systems, and they achieved this using only natural materials and medieval construction techniques. For sleeping, they created what were essentially personal thermal chambers. box beds built into the walls, lined with furs and closed off with curtains, trapped body heat so effectively that people could sleep comfortably even when the main hall temperatures dropped. These weren't just beds, they were individual heating systems that used body heat and insulation to create warm microclimates within the larger heated space. In the most extreme conditions, they brought their livestock inside, and this wasn't because they were primitive, it was because they were smart. A single cow produces about 1,500 watts of heat. That's like having a space heater that also gives you milk. They had turned their homes into integrated heating systems that used every available heat source efficiently. Staying warm was only half the battle, though. Vikings had to solve an even more challenging puzzle: how to store enough food to survive 6 to 8 months when nothing grows, and hunting becomes nearly impossible. What they achieved in food preservation was so advanced, it seems almost magical by even our modern standards. Vikings were creating what we would now call superfoods, 1,000 years before we understood nutrition science. Take skyr, their fermented dairy product. Modern nutritional analysis shows it contains probiotics that boost immune systems and provides essential nutrients that prevent scurvy, a disease that was killing sailors centuries later. They had accidentally created one of the healthiest foods imaginable through trial and error over generations. They had mastered fermentation to a degree that defies logic for the time period. Cabbage was fermented into what we'd recognize as sauerkraut that could last months and provided vitamin C through the darkest winter months. Dairy products were transformed into cheese and skyr that could be stored in wooden barrels for half a year without spoiling, providing protein and calcium when fresh food was impossible to find. The fermentation process they used created natural preservatives that prevented spoilage while actually increasing nutritional value. Modern food scientists studying Viking fermentation techniques have found that their methods produced higher levels of beneficial bacteria and vitamins than many contemporary fermented foods. They weren't just preserving food, they were improving it. Their fish preservation technique was so advanced, it challenges everything we think we know about medieval food storage. They created stockfish by air drying cod until it became like leather. This fish could last for years, not months, without any refrigeration whatsoever. Archaeological finds have uncovered stockfish that was multiple winters old and still perfectly edible, according to modern food scientists. The process of creating stockfish required precise knowledge of weather patterns, humidity levels, and timing. They had to know exactly when to catch the fish, how to prepare it, and where to hang it for optimal drying conditions. This wasn't just hanging fish outside and hoping for the best. It was a sophisticated preservation technology that required generations of accumulated knowledge. For vegetables, they engineered cold storage systems that worked like natural refrigerators. Underground cellars and pits kept root vegetables just above freezing, preventing spoilage but avoiding the freeze damage that would ruin them. These weren't simple holes in the ground. They were carefully constructed storage systems with drainage and ventilation to maintain optimal conditions. Every autumn, they conducted what historians call calculated slaughter, killing most of their cattle and pigs before winter hit. This wasn't desperation, it was strategy. Fresh meat was immediately smoked, dried, or cured, using techniques that provided protein stores lasting until spring. They understood the mathematics of survival in a way that's actually quite sophisticated. The timing of this slaughter was critical and required extensive knowledge of animal husbandry, weather patterns, and preservation techniques. Too early, and they'd have to feed animals through more of the harsh season. Too late, and they might lose animals to cold or starvation before they could preserve the meat properly. Modern nutritionists who have analyzed Viking winter diets found something incredible. Their preserved foods provided better balanced nutrition than many modern diets. The high-fat content from preserved meats, the probiotics from fermented foods, and the vitamins from preserved vegetables created a perfectly engineered survival diet that sustained not just life, but health and strength through months of harsh conditions. Here's something most people don't realize about surviving a Norse winter. The physical challenges of staying warm and fed were only part of the problem. The psychological challenge was enormous. We're talking about months of darkness, isolation, and confinement that would drive most people to severe depression or worse. Vikings faced what we now know as seasonal affective disorder on a massive scale. In northern regions, the sun would disappear for weeks or months at a time. Modern research shows this causes depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline in most people. Yet Vikings not only survived this psychological assault, they maintained complex societies and even thrived culturally during these dark months. They created what might be the world's first systematic mental health program, and they called it Kvöldvaka, the evening wake. Every night, the entire community would gather around the central hearth for structured social interaction that was far more sophisticated than casual conversation. This was organized entertainment, education, and psychological support, all rolled into one brilliant system. The structure of Kvöldvaka wasn't random or spontaneous. It followed specific patterns that modern psychologists recognize as effective group therapy techniques. There were designated storytellers, organized activities, and social roles that ensured everyone participated and felt valued. This wasn't just hanging out, it was systematic community mental health maintenance. Skalds would recite epic poems and sagas that could last for hours, preserving history while providing gripping entertainment. These weren't just stories, they were complex narratives that taught moral lessons, preserved legal precedents, and maintained cultural identity. The sagas served as entertainment, education, and psychological reinforcement of community values and individual worth. Elders would tell stories that weren't just fun, they were educational, passing down crucial survival knowledge through memorable narratives. Children would learn through games and riddles that developed their minds while keeping them engaged. Every night became a festival of human connection that fought off the isolation and depression that dark winters could bring. But here's the genius part that modern psychologists have only recently recognized. They combined mental health maintenance with productivity. While stories were being told and social bonds were being strengthened, hands were busy. Women spun wool and wove cloth that would be needed for the next year. Men carved tools and repaired equipment. Children learned essential crafts. This combination of social interaction, mental stimulation, and productive activity hits all the key elements that modern psychology identifies as essential for mental health. They had created a system that provided purpose, community, learning, and accomplishment all simultaneously. The long winter nights became a time of skill development and preparation rather than just survival. They understood the importance of play for mental health in ways that seem almost modern. Archaeological evidence shows they played complex board games like Anefatafel, strategy games that kept minds sharp during months of confinement. They held wrestling matches and indoor competitions to release physical energy and maintain fitness when outdoor activity was limited. The centerpiece of their psychological survival strategy was Yule, a midwinter festival that lasted up to 12 days. This wasn't just a party, it was a carefully timed psychological intervention, placed right at the darkest point of winter, when depression and despair would be at their worst. During Yule, entire communities would come together. Families would slaughter their fattest animals for massive feasts, and they'd consume specially brewed ales and meads that had been fermenting since summer. The timing of Yule shows sophisticated understanding of seasonal psychology. It came right at the winter solstice, the darkest point of the year, providing maximum psychological impact when it was most needed. The festival included elements of light, food abundance, social gathering, and religious significance, hitting every aspect of human psychological need during the most challenging time. Now let's talk about something that will completely change how you think about medieval technology: Viking clothing systems. When modern outdoor gear companies have studied Viking textiles and clothing methods, they've found innovations that weren't rediscovered until the 20th century. Vikings didn't just throw on more clothes when it got cold, they had engineered a sophisticated layering system based on moisture management and thermal regulation that's actually superior to many modern approaches. The base layer was linen, a breathable fabric that pulled moisture away from the skin, preventing the deadly combination of sweat and cold that kills people in extreme conditions. The science behind their layering system is actually quite advanced. They understood that trapped air provides insulation, that moisture kills insulation effectiveness, and that different materials work better in different positions within the layering system. This knowledge took modern outdoor gear companies decades to rediscover and implement effectively. The primary insulation layer was wool, but not just any wool. Vikings had selectively bred sheep that produced a double fleece. The soft undercoat provided insulation, while the outer hairs repelled water. This natural textile was actually superior to many modern synthetic materials in terms of warmth retention, even when wet. For extreme conditions, they used reindeer hide, and here's where it gets really incredible. Reindeer hair is hollow, creating natural insulation chambers that trap warm air. The sagas describe warriors whose reindeer skin coats were so thick and effective that swords would glance off them. This wasn't just clothing, it was armor against both weapons and cold. The hollow structure of reindeer hair creates what modern materials scientists call aerogel-like properties. Each hair acts as a tiny insulation tube, creating thousands of individual air pockets that provide exceptional thermal protection. This is the same principle used in modern aerospace insulation materials. They had developed waterproofing technology that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. Textiles were treated with animal fats and oils to repel moisture. They understood that staying dry was critical to staying warm, so their outer garments functioned like medieval Gore-Tex, keeping moisture out while allowing body heat to stay in. Their footwear was especially advanced, featuring multi-layered construction with wool socks inside leather boots lined with fur. But they went further, stuffing dry grass or moss inside for additional insulation and moisture absorption. Some boots had wooden or bone soles to insulate feet from frozen ground. They had solved the problem of keeping extremities warm in ways that many modern outdoor enthusiasts still struggle with. The construction of Viking footwear shows understanding of complex thermal dynamics. They knew that feet generate moisture that can freeze, that ground contact is a major source of heat loss, and that different materials work better in different parts of the foot system. Modern winter boot design still uses many of the same principles they developed. For hands, they created specialized protection systems. Mittens were preferred over gloves because fingers could share warmth. But these weren't simple mittens. They were engineered with leather palms for grip and fur linings for insulation. Some even had separate thumb sections that could be covered for maximum warmth when fine motor control wasn't needed. Head protection was critical because you lose up to 40% of body heat through your head. Viking caps and hoods weren't just practical, they were precisely designed for different conditions. Some hoods had face protection that could be adjusted based on wind conditions. Others had ear flaps that could be tied under the chin for maximum coverage. We've talked about Viking heating systems, but let's dive deeper into their construction technology, because what they achieved with medieval tools honestly defies explanation. These weren't just crude shelters, they were sophisticated buildings that incorporated engineering principles that wouldn't be formally recognized for centuries. They understood thermal mass in ways that seem almost impossible for the time period. By partially burying their houses, they used the earth itself as a thermal battery that would absorb heat during the day and release it at night. This isn't just folk wisdom, this is advanced physics applied to architecture using only natural materials and hand tools. The physics of thermal mass involves understanding heat capacity, thermal conductivity, and thermal lag. Vikings somehow figured out that certain materials store heat better than others, that earth temperature is more stable than air temperature, and that timing heat storage and release could maintain comfortable temperatures around the clock. Their wall construction was essentially medieval double-pane insulation, inner and outer walls with air gaps filled with moss, turf, or other insulating materials created thermal barriers that modern builders would recognize as sophisticated. In Greenland, some walls were nearly 2 meters thick. That's more insulation than many modern homes. And all this was achieved using only materials they could gather locally. The roofs were engineering marvels that solved multiple problems simultaneously. Steep wooden frames were designed to shed snow and rain while supporting massive loads. These frames were covered with layers of turf that could be up to 6 feet thick, creating incredible insulation while actually using the weight of the roof to compress and strengthen the entire structure. The structural engineering required to support these massive turf roofs is actually quite advanced. They had to calculate load distributions, understand how different materials behave under stress, and design frameworks that could handle both static loads and dynamic forces from wind and weather. All of this was done using only experience and intuitive understanding of structural principles. They solved the ventilation problem that stumped builders for centuries after them. How do you get fresh air and remove smoke without losing precious heat? They created sophisticated roof vents and airflow patterns that allowed smoke to escape while maintaining circulation that didn't create cold drafts. The physics of their ventilation systems show an understanding of air pressure and flow that seems remarkably advanced. Every aspect of longhouse design served multiple functions in ways that show systematic thinking. The central hearth wasn't just for heating, it was the cooking center, social hub, light source, and food preservation facility where meat and fish were smoked. The long, low design minimized surface area exposed to wind while maximizing internal volume for heat retention. For temporary shelters during travel, Vikings could construct effective protection using minimal materials and tools. Archaeological evidence shows they could build insulated shelters from turf, branches, and snow that would keep people alive in extreme conditions for extended periods. These weren't desperate improvisations. They were proven techniques that could be quickly deployed when needed. What really demonstrates their engineering genius is how they adapted techniques to different environments. In tree-rich Norway, they used timber frames with sophisticated joinery. In treeless Iceland and Greenland, they built with stone and turf, using completely different methods. In the most extreme Arctic conditions, they even used whale ribs as structural supports, showing incredible adaptability and resource optimization. Now, let me show you the evidence that proves just how effective these techniques really were, because the stories of Viking winter survival aren't just legends or exaggerations, they're documented historical fact, backed up by modern archaeological science. In Greenland, Vikings established settlements that lasted for over 400 years in conditions that modern Arctic researchers describe as barely habitable for long-term occupation. Archaeological excavations have found evidence of multi-generational families not just surviving, but thriving in structures built using the techniques we've been discussing. The Greenland settlements represent one of the most challenging colonization efforts in human history. The climate was harsh, resources were limited, and they were completely isolated from outside support for months at a time. Yet they maintained complex communities with specialized crafts, trade networks, and cultural traditions for centuries. At excavation sites in Iceland, archaeologists have found Viking storehouses with preserved food that's over 1,000 years old. Stockfish, fermented dairy products, and preserved grains were still identifiable, and according to food scientists, would have been perfectly edible when stored. This isn't luck or exceptional preservation conditions. This was systematic food storage technology that actually worked for the intended purposes. The Lofoten Islands in Norway have extensive evidence of Viking communities that supported hundreds of people through winters that regularly dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Bone analysis from burial sites shows these populations were well-nourished and healthy throughout winter months, proving their food preservation and rationing systems were effective. Climate reconstructions using ice core data and tree ring analysis show that Vikings survived through both warmer and colder periods, including the transition into the Little Ice Age, when temperatures dropped significantly across northern Europe. Yet, their settlements continued to function and even expand, proving their techniques worked, even when conditions became more challenging. Modern experimental archaeologists have attempted to replicate Viking winter survival using only period-appropriate techniques and materials. The results have been remarkable. Test subjects not only survived comfortably, but reported being warmer and better fed than they expected, even in conditions that would challenge modern outdoor enthusiasts with high-tech gear. These experimental projects provide direct evidence that Viking techniques work as described in historical sources. Modern researchers living in reconstructed longhouses, eating preserved foods, and using traditional clothing have validated the effectiveness of these ancient methods under controlled scientific conditions. Scientific studies have validated many specific Viking techniques. Their fermentation methods produced foods with higher nutritional value and better preservation than many modern processed foods. Their insulation techniques achieved thermal efficiency ratings that compete favorably with modern materials. Their construction methods created structures that have lasted over 1,000 years in harsh climates. The sagas themselves provide incredible survival accounts that have been verified through archaeological evidence. Stories of groups surviving entire winters trapped by ice using only traditional techniques have been confirmed by excavations that show the locations and material evidence of these events. When they emerged in spring, historical accounts described them as healthy enough to continue their journeys, not weakened survivors barely clinging to life. Settlement size data from archaeological surveys shows that Viking communities maintained stable or growing populations throughout the medieval period, even during particularly harsh winters that devastated other European populations. This demographic stability proves their survival techniques worked not just for individuals, but for entire communities over multiple generations. Here's why understanding Viking winter survival techniques isn't just historical curiosity, it's potentially life-saving knowledge that's more relevant today than it's been in centuries. With climate change creating more extreme weather events, Power grid failures becoming more common, and supply chains increasingly fragile, the self-sufficiency techniques Vikings mastered could literally save your life when modern systems fail. When the power goes out and your heat stops working, when supply trucks can't get through and grocery stores are empty, will you know how to stay warm and fed using only what's around you? Vikings did, and their methods work just as well today as they did 1,000 years ago, maybe better with some modern materials mixed in. The increasing frequency of extreme weather events means that more people are finding themselves in survival situations that Vikings faced routinely. Ice storms that knock out power for weeks, blizzards that strand communities, and supply chain disruptions that empty store shelves all create conditions where Viking survival knowledge becomes directly applicable. Modern survival experts and preppers are rediscovering Viking techniques and finding them superior to many high-tech alternatives. Natural insulation methods using materials you can gather yourself, efficient heating systems that don't require electricity or gas, and food preservation techniques that work without refrigeration or modern preservatives. The sustainability aspect is incredible and directly relevant to current environmental concerns. Vikings created closed-loop systems where nothing was wasted. Food scraps fed animals, animal waste fertilized crops, building materials came from the local environment and returned to it naturally. This is circular economy, thinking that we're just beginning to rediscover and implement on a larger scale. Perhaps most importantly, their psychological survival strategies, community building, structured social interaction, and productive use of isolation time, these are directly applicable to modern challenges. Whether you're surviving a natural disaster, dealing with extended power outages, or just getting through a difficult winter, Viking social technologies for maintaining mental health and community cohesion actually work. The mental health challenges of modern life, particularly during crises or isolation periods, are remarkably similar to what Vikings faced during long winter months. Their solutions for maintaining morale, purpose, and community connection are being studied by modern psychologists and community organizers. You can apply these techniques today using modern materials and tools. The layering principles for clothing work just as well with modern fabrics. The thermal mass concepts for heating can be incorporated into home design or emergency shelter construction. The fermentation methods for food preservation can be done in any kitchen with basic equipment. In an age where we're increasingly dependent on complex systems that can fail catastrophically, Viking self-reliance techniques provide a proven backup plan. They demonstrated that humans can not only survive, but thrive in the harshest conditions using knowledge, ingenuity, and community cooperation, rather than just technology and external resources. The mystery isn't really how Vikings survived impossible winters. The mystery is how we managed to forget these techniques that kept people alive and healthy for centuries. But now you know, and knowledge like this doesn't just satisfy curiosity about the past, it builds confidence and practical capability that could make the difference between surviving and thriving when modern conveniences disappear. Viking techniques represent a complete survival system that's been tested under extreme conditions for generations. Learning these methods provides both practical skills and the confidence that comes from understanding proven ways to handle whatever challenges winter can throw at you, whether you're dealing with a power outage or a complete system failure. So there you have it, the complete system of techniques that allowed Vikings to thrive in conditions that would kill most people today. These ancient methods are not just historical curiosities. They are solutions to problems we are rediscovering in our modern world. Give a nod to your inner Viking, pillage that like button, and subscribe for more fascinating journeys into Midgard living.